Welcome to the third part of my series about making my Nadja cosplay. This is a really exciting installment because today we are actually going to start the dress. We have the combinations, we have the corset, we have a petticoat, everything we need to start the final dress. I did have to make a couple of changes to the dress because of practicality reasons. The actual dress seems to button up in the back and is all like one seamless piece. My version is a two-piece ensemble with the bodice closures in the front. These changes were, like I said, for practicality's sake, so that I would have an easier time getting in and out of the costume, especially if there was a time in which I had to get myself dressed. With the closures in the back, it would have made it absolutely impossible. I used two different patterns for the dress. For the skirt, I used a truly Victorian TV 297 flared skirt pattern. I used truly Victorian patterns for the undergarments, the combinations corset and petticoat, and I really liked them. I felt confident that they would actually have my size and I wouldn't have to make a lot of pattern alterations to the skirt because of that. On the other hand, the bodice was a lot trickier. I ended up using the Butterick B6537 bodice jacket and skirt making history pattern. I couldn't find a pattern that was the exact match for the bodice of the dress, so I found something that I could alter to be a better match. Okay, so let's talk about the main fabric of the dress. It's this beautiful black and brown damask fabric, and it's very, very distinctive. I knew going in that there was probably no way I was gonna get an exact match of the fabric because it's so distinctive. I honestly did not expect to have as much trouble as I had though. I knew I wanted to find something that was a natural woven fabric, and I wanted to definitely avoid this metallic shine that a lot of fabric makers put into damask fabrics that you can find online. I remember I tried so many different websites, but everything was either just way too off or was like completely out of my price range. I also started researching how to print your own fabric, but to be honest, the idea of having to draw out and like copy the fabric of that dress was like really, really daunting. And at this point, I was just really close to just picking a different outfit because I didn't find anything I was happy with. But I realized I never actually checked Joann's Fabrics website. And when I did, I found out that Joann's has customizable fabric patterns. I was able to find a pattern that was similar enough, or a repeating pattern that was similar enough to the dress fabric, and I was able to change the colors around so that it matched the coloring of the dress, and I scaled down the pattern and the repeating in a way that matched the real dress's fabric a lot better, and I was really happy with what I was able to find. The biggest downside to using the Joann's customizable fabric thing is that it's really expensive. The fabric ended up being $22.50 a yard because I knew I needed a cotton twill, and even that was like, and like that's pretty expensive for fabric, especially since like this is just for a cosplay I'm making. I really wanted it though, so what I ended up doing is I spent months saving up to buy this fabric, and they had a Memorial Day sale for last year when I made the dress, and I was able to get the fabric for $16 a yard instead of $22.50, which was a lot better. That one I could swing, and I needed like 5 yards also, so yeah, it still ended up being pretty expensive, but like I said, I ended up having to save for a while. Stuff like that is why I only ended up making one cosplay a year, is because money, yeah. And it was an exact match to the dress on screen, but that was the best I was going to be able to get, I think.
The specially printed cotton twill from Joann's. Black silk velvet from Silk Baron. muslin, sew-in interfacing,
single fold 1-inch bias tape,
skirt hooks and eyes, hooks and eyes, black polyester lace trim,
some black floral trim from Joann's,
and of course, thread. The first thing I needed to do for this project was to make a pattern for the bodice. I cut out the front, side back, and sleeve pattern pieces and traced the pieces onto paper, notating where the markings are on the original pattern. I then expanded the pattern using the slash and spread method. I didn't film this part because patterning can be kind of stressful for me, but I will find a good tutorial and link it down below. The first mock-up was to enlarge the pattern so that it fit better on my body. The second mock-up added the color blocking and adjusted the darts. The third mock-up fixed the darts and smoothed everything out nicely. Once I was happy with the final bodice pattern, I then started to cut out the skirt. This might seem like a big shift from what I was doing earlier, but the skirt needed to be cut out of the fashion fabric first because of how massive it is. I cut out both the fashion fabric and a muslin lining. The pattern came with the 1/2-inch seam allowance already built in. The back flounce pattern pieces ended up being too wide for the fabric when it was put on the proper grain lines, so I actually ended up having to piece those panels together. Once everything was cut and pressed nice and flat, I then flatlined the pieces together by sewing a long basting stitch in the seam allowances of the skirt. When flatlining, it's usually easier to start with the sides and then do the top and bottom of the pieces. I then put the flatline skirt pieces to the side and started working on the bodice again. I then took apart the bodice mock-up and used the correct side to cut out the bodice. If I was a smarter seamstress, I would have made a real pattern out of the mock-up. However, since I'm not and I was on a time crunch, I skipped transferring the pattern onto paper and just used the mock-up pieces as the lining. Most of the pieces were cut out of the damask fabric and the top part was cut out of the velvet. All of the pieces had a muslin lining cut along with the fashion fabric. I decided to wait on cutting the sleeves and collar until I was further along with the bodice. The next thing that needed to be done was to flatline the bodice pieces. I decided to do this by hand instead of doing it in the machine like the skirt because the pieces were a lot smaller. The velvet was also really slippery and I was worried about crushing it in the machine. I then needed to stitch the color blocking in the front and back pieces so they made one full piece. When they were stitched together, I went ahead and filled those seams down as I figured it would be easier to do it here than it would be when the bodice was more put together. Filing is a seam finishing technique where you cut down the seam allowance on one side of the seam, fold the other seam over the cut down seam allowance, and then whip stitch it down. It makes a really nice inside, and you don't get extra stitching lines on the outside of the clothing. I then added darts to the front of the bodice. At this point, I just seamed together the bodice as per pattern instructions. I added the bodice extension for the closures on the front right side of the bodice and also added front facings to the bodice to get a nice clean edge. The insides of the bodice facings were slip stitched onto the bodice fronts. Once the seams were finished, I cut bone casing to go over the darts, side seams, and one in the center back of the bodice, and I attached the bone casing to the bodice using a cross stitch. I then inserted some plastic boning in the bone casing. I then put the bodice aside and started to work on the skirt again. First, I added darts to the front panels to make a nice flat front. I then just sewed up the side seams of the skirt according to pattern instructions, stopping a little bit above the ankle so I can add a kick pleat. I then finished the seams by felling, which is the same finishing technique I've done for most of the rest of the costume. At this point, I had most of the skirt and the bodice together. What was left was adding the sleeves and collar to the bodice and a whole lot of finishing. I put the skirt to the side again and started to work on the bodice. The next thing I needed to do was to make a collar. This was a bit tricky. Since the bodice pattern I used was an upsized pattern, the collar from the pattern didn't fit the bodice anymore, and I had to extend it also, which was a task that absolutely broke my brain. So I just ended up adding some length to the collar and just kind of finessed it into a way that looked nice. I also added interfacing to the inside of the collar so that it would have an easier time standing up on its own. I slip stitched the inside of the collar to the inside of the bodice for a nice clean finish. And with that, we have a finished collar.
Next, I cut the sleeves. I didn't need to upsize the sleeves at all, so I just used the original pattern piece. There was already a lot of extra space at the top of the sleeves because they're supposed to get gathered down pretty tightly. The sleeves are made from the same velvet as the collar and the black color blocking on the bodice and were flatlined with muslin. After flatlining the sleeves, I sewed up each sleeve and finished the seams after making sure they would fit. I then sewed a large running stitch in the sleeve head and gathered it down into the arm's eye. I also cut out a sleeve head out of interfacing and then gathered it. After the sleeve head gets gathered down, it's going to be sewn in the seam allowance of the top of the sleeve, and it should give a nice base for the sleeve to poof out on. Super gathered down sleeve head is an iconic part of this time period, so it was very important that this looked nice.
After gathering the sleeves down nice and pretty, I sewed the sleeves into the arm side. I also sewed the sleeve head interfacing into the seam allowance of the arm side. It was then time to do some bodice finishing. I measured out and pinned a loop of black bias tape around the arm's eye. I stitched the right sides together on the machine. And then slip stitched the bias tape to the inside after giving it a good press. I then repeated the same process for the hems of the sleeves and the hems of the bodice. Finally, I sewed about 1,000,000 hooks and eyes to the front of the bodice. And with that, we have a completely finished bodice. So now I needed to finish the skirt. So first I needed to finish the kick pleat. I just kind of folded over the inside so that it looked nice, and then I whip stitched it to the inside of the skirt. In retrospect, I probably made this too hard and was overthinking it, because I remember struggling with this pretty badly for some reason, but I was fine with the result of it. I then added a facing to the back of the skirt by making a little panel and then top stitching that to the inside of the right back skirt opening. I then put a box pleat onto each side of the back opening to give a little bit extra flair. I then sewed skirt hooks to the left side of the back opening. I then added a waistband and put skirt hooks in the waistband also. I then moved on to finishing the hem of the skirt. This type of skirt calls for a stiffened hem facing, so first I cut and sewed together a very long loop of sew-in interfacing that was about 2 inches wide. After sewing the massive loop of interfacing together, I then basted it in the hem of the bottom of the skirt. I then made another loop out of the same fabric I used for the skirt at about 3 inches wide. I then stitched the loop on the machine right sides together so that it would fold into the inside of the skirt. I then flipped the facing up and pinned it to the inside of the skirt so that the sew-in interfacing was tucked into the inside of the facing. I then cross-stitched the entire facing to the inside of the skirt. As of now, the dress is completely done construction-wise, but I did want to add a little bit of something extra to the skirt. You don't really get to see what the dress looks like below the waist, so I don't think this is accurate, but I do think it's pretty.
Okay, so that is the end of making this cosplay. I really love the way it turned out. There are a couple of things, I mean, there's always like a couple of things that you wish turned out a little bit better. The big thing to me is the collar. I wish it like stood up a little straighter, but I think it looks fine. Yeah, this was very challenging. I had a great time making it. I really enjoyed making these dress diaries, although they took forever to come out. I'm gonna put my socials along with all the materials I used to make this dress and the description down at the bottom. Thank you all so much for making it to the end of another video. I hoped it was enjoyable to watch. It was definitely like a different experience trying to film and compile all of this footage to make the dress diary, along with like editing it and all that. It was just like, you know, I was kind of unprepared about how much extra work it was, but I did enjoy the process, so hopefully I'll be able to make more of these videos soonish. But yeah, so thank you very much for watching.